Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of March of the Machine spoilers. And we've reached week 2 of spoiler season. Actually, we've only got a couple days to go. We get the full set on Wednesday, but today, my god, do we have some ridiculous stuff to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking spicy new March of the Machines cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. And number two, if you need some of these cards, you can snag them from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Anyway, let's talk March of the Machines. First up today, we got the return of Kroxa and Kunoros, and good lord is this creature ridiculous. So it's a 6 mana Mardu mythic legendary elder giant dog. It's a 6/6 with vigilance, menace, and lifelink, and it says when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can exile 5 cards from your graveyard. When you do, reanimate target creature, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this card is not only super sweet, it's also super flavorful. It calls back to Kroxa. You get this 6/6 stats, and then essentially, if you think about it, the exile 5 cards from your graveyard, along with being a bit of a safety valve power level wise, it's also escaping. You got to exile 5 cards to help something else escape from your graveyard, which is super flavorful. And then you get the Kunoros, vigilance, and menace, and lifelink. When you smash that all together, it is kind of ridiculous. A little bit awkward that Kunoros actually prevents cards from coming into play from your graveyard. I don't know how that actually works flavor wise, but this card is bonkers. If you think about creatures that can reanimate, they're usually pretty underpowered, like Young Necromancer or Phyrexian Delver. You're paying 5 mana to get a 2/3 or a 3/2, and that's just not much of a threat. Like, it's nice when you reanimate something, but it's not much of a body on the battlefield. Think about Sharoom the Hegemon. Sharoom is actually maybe one of the better comparisons. It's got legit stats as a 5 mana 5/5 flyer, reanimates an artifact when it comes into play. Kroxa is even better than that. You're hitting creatures, and its body is just nuts. It's essentially like a Worm Coil or Inferno Titan or a Grave Titan. If you think about it, it's got the ETB trigger, it's got the attack trigger, it works like a Titan, and you're also getting Worm Coil's massive life-linking body. It does something right away, assuming you reanimate something. Even if it dies, you did something. And even if you can't reanimate, let's say your graveyard gets completely shut down, which is the nightmare for most reanimation, well, you're still getting a 6/6 vigilance menacing lifelinker that could potentially reanimate again in the future. So I think this immediately becomes the go-to reanimation in Standard. If you think about what people are using to reanimate right now, people are cheating Atraxa or Titan of Industry into play with Cruelty of Gix or Invoke Justice. Kroxa and Kunoros is 1 more mana, 1 additional mana, except you get the upside of having a ridiculous creature. Like, it's a body that can win the game all by itself. So I imagine that we're going to see decks that are getting Atraxa in the graveyard, playing Kroxa and Kunoros, getting back Atraxa, and just straight up winning the game. We're in a Standard where getting stuff in the graveyard super easy. So yes, it is true, graveyard hate is a thing. There's a lot of incidental graveyard hate, graveyard trespassers and whatnot, but there's also just a lot of incidental ways to fill the graveyard. The RDC play Blood Tithe Harvester, Fable the Mirror Breaker. So yes, there are going to be situations where your graveyard gets locked down, or maybe you don't have enough cards in your graveyard, but there's enough cards that shouldn't be a super huge concern. And like we talked about before, it really gets around the drawback of most reanimation. The downside of most reanimation is it's busted if your graveyard's active, but it is stone unplayable, do nothing if your graveyard's shut down. Kroxa and Kunoros really gets around this. Like, it's going to be absurd when your graveyard's active. When you're playing this in reanimating Kroxa, you essentially are just going to win the game. Like, the game is going to end. On the other hand, maybe your opponent finds a Lane Line to the Void or a Tormod's Crypt or Graveyard Trespasser's been eating away your graveyard. Yeah, whatever. 6/6 Vigilance Menace Lifelink. So it solves reanimation's biggest problem. It is ridiculous how much better this is than other options. Remember a year ago, we had a Innistrad set where Olivia's wedding was like the big deal about the set. It was all about vampires, all about Olivia getting married. So we finally got Olivia. It's the big mythic from the set, and it's a 6 mana 3/4 flying haste that when it attacks you can reanimate a creature tapped and attacking, but if you ever don't have a legendary vampire, you lose that creature. So if your opponent just kills Olivia, you lose your other creature as well. Kroxa and Kunoros is like so much better than Olivia. It's kind of blowing my mind that this card is just like, I mean, it's a hype card. It's Kroxa, it's Kunoros. There's some characters people love, but it's not like the focal point of the set. This is just another team up legendary pairing in the set, and it is like so much stronger than Olivia was. And Olivia was supposed to be one of the face cards of her set. This card is just over the top ridiculous. You can even do some sweet double reanimation tricks. Imagine like you're playing in Modern, you get a big graveyard, you Goryo's Vengeance, you get back Kroxa and Kunoros, and then you escape a Griselbrand into play, earn a Kroxa into play, so you double up your reanimation fun. The one place where this card is going to be less good is in some of the turbo reanimation shells that we see in Legacy or some like high-powered commander decks. If your game plan is Entomb Reanimate, Kroxa and Kunoros a lot less exciting because having 5 cards in your graveyard is not going to be very likely if you're trying to do this like on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3. So this is a little bit fairer in the sense that it's going to be most high powered in the mid game after you've had a few turns of filling your graveyard and setting things up. So keep that in mind. I don't think this is going to replace, you know, Griselbrand in Legacy or anything like that. I do think this will be a very popular commander card. I think most commander decks, things are going to be going in and out of the graveyards. You have fetch lands, you have things dying, you have looting effects, card draw effects, instants and sorceries ending up in the graveyard. If you are in Mardu and you just want to play this card for value, I think you can. It's going to be at its best though in a reanimation deck. Like if you build around this, this is a really, really strong commander. Even at 6 mana, having this 6 mana repeatable reanimation effect sitting in your command zone is absurd. So Kroxa and Kunoros, super hyped for this card. To me, this looks like the return of Grave Titan, Inferno Titan, Wormcoil Engine, some of the most powerful 6-drops we've seen in the past. It lines up well with Standard, synergizes with many of the best cards in the format. We got one of the best reanimation targets ever in Standard currently, so I would be absolutely shocked if Kroxa and Kunoros were not making huge waves in Standard and might even have some fringe implications in older 60-card formats, and definitely a Commander All-Star too. This card is just absurd. Next up, we got Glistening Dawn, a 4-mana green sorcery that says incubate X twice, where X is the number of lands you control. So if you think about what this card is actually saying, let's say you cast it on turn 4, you got 4 lands, you're going to get 2 incubates that each have 4 counters, and then you pay 2 mana at any time to turn them into creatures. So is Glistening Dawn actually good? And I think the answer is yes, but not at 4 mana. Like, if you think about that 4 mana play we were just talking about, you cast this, it does nothing. I guess it adds 2 artifacts to the battlefield, but it doesn't add any creatures or any power and toughness immediately to the battlefield. And since you have to pay 2 mana to flip the incubates, unless you have some other shenanigans, but you normally got to pay 2 mana, which means really you're paying 8 mana for 2 4/4s, which doesn't seem very good. On the other hand, let's say you wait until you have 6 lands on the battlefield, or maybe 8 lands on the battlefield. Then this card adds a ton of power and toughness to the battlefield. Let's say you have 6 lands, you cast this, you're going to get 2 6/6 incubates. You got enough mana that you can flip one right away if you want to and still have another one left over. Getting 2 6/6s for 8 mana, that's not bad. If you have 8 lands, you're going to get 2 8/8s for 8 mana. So the more lands you get on the battlefield, the better this is going to be. So I see this mostly as a ramp card. Like if you're playing a Topiary Stomper, Titania's Command, Invasion of Zendikar, some sort of ramp deck, this can actually be very, very powerful. There is upsides to the incubates not immediately being creatures. You can like cast this and make some big incubates and then maybe Farewell and Wrath the board, and then after the board is clean, flip up your incubates, swing in, they get like pseudo haste. If they're already on the battlefield, they're going to be able to attack right away. That seems like a reasonable line for some sort of like Selesnya ramp deck or Bant ramp style deck. So I think that's going to be the main home for this card. The other way to maybe take advantage of this is cards that just straight up transform your incubates. This curves into Glissa, like turn 4 you Glistening Dawn, you get the 2 4/4s that are incubated. Then the next turn you can Glissa and just transform all your incubators and get those 2 4/4s for free without spending any mana to flip them. We can also do this with like the backside of Elesh Norn, so there's probably some additional synergies there. So Glistening Dawn, I think you gotta be a ramp deck basically. I think if you're just playing this fairly, it's probably not gonna be good enough. It's actively bad on turn 4. I don't think you can afford to just take turn 4 off in most games as standard, but if you can get up to 6 mana, 8 mana, or anything above that, then this card adds a ton of power and toughness to the battlefield and has some extra little tricky synergies thrown in. We also got an interesting Convoke creature in Zephyr Singer. So 4 mana 3/4, except you can Convoke it. It has flying and vigilance, and when it ETBs, you get to put a flying counter on each creature that convoked it. So this can potentially be 0 mana, tap 4 creatures, give all those creatures permanently flying, and get a 3/4 flying vigilance. That's actually a pretty reasonable threat. One quick note on Convoke, because I saw some people confused about this. So the way Convoke works is you can tap creatures that match the color of your creature's mana symbols to pay for the card. So you can tap 2 creatures of any color to pay for the 2 generic mana, and then you can also tap 2 blue creatures to pay for the blue mana. So you can cast this card for no mana at all. You can use Convoke to reduce colored mana costs along with generic mana costs. So think about how this card would actually play. Turn 1 you play a Skrelv, turn 2 you play a Denic, turn 3 you can Convoke out Zephyr Singer, give your Denic and Skrelv flying, and get a 3/4 flying vigilance. Like, that seems kind of reasonable. If you really want to go deep, you can focus more on giving big threats flying. Like an Adolin with flying is going to close out games really quickly. A Sheoldred with flying is going to close out games really quickly. These are slower cards, although Zephyr Singer does work well with vigilance. Like, you can attack with Adolin, get in some damage, and then post-combat, use it to Convoke out your Zephyr Singer, give it flying for the next turn. We also have a bit of a token and vigilance sub-theme in blue. Like, Invasion of New Phyrexia works really well with Zephyr Singers. 2 and X to make X/2/2 white and blue night creature tokens with vigilance. So you can play this and like make a bunch of tokens and then attack with those tokens with vigilance and then use them to Convoke out Zephyr Singer, give all those tokens flying. Could also see some sort of tempo play. We got a lot of cards that can make tokens at instant speed, protect the negotiators, resolute reinforcements. Maybe you're like flashing in resolute reinforcements at the end of your opponent's turn after leaving up interaction and then using it to Convoke out Zephyr Singers the following turn to get a pretty reasonable body on the battlefield. The other place that this can be relevant is in flying tribal decks. There's a couple of commanders in specific, like Iniaz and Kangi, that specifically care about you having creatures with flying. One of the sneaky upsides of Zephyr Singer is this can be giving creatures in your deck that you're playing for other reasons. Maybe you're playing them to ramp or draw cards or whatever, but you can give those creatures flying. So this is a way to turn non-flying creatures into flying creatures to synergize with your commander with the theme of your deck. So Zephyr Singer, I don't think the card's broken, but it's got decent stats. If you really think it through, 4 mana 3/4 flying vigilance, that's not really constructed playable. 3 mana 3/4 flying vigilance, they give something else flying, then you're getting to a reasonable card. If this is 2 or less mana, then you're getting an actively strong card. So I think Zephyr Singer definitely has a chance to see constructed play. It's partly going to depend on the meta. Like, if there's a bunch of 4/4 flying dragons running around or 5/5 flying angels running around, then this card looks much, much sillier. But in a meta where this can consistently get in damage in the air and send the rest of your team to the air, it could be a pretty good threat. We also got a pretty sweet removal spell in Nahiri's Warcraft. So 3 mana sorcery, 5 damage to a creature, planeswalker, or battle. Then you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the excess damage that was dealt this way. You get to exile one of those cards, the rest go on the bottom, and you can play the exiled card until end of turn. So essentially what this is a Rending Flame or a Rebel Salvo, with the downside being it's sorcery speed, but it's a removal spell that kills Sheoldred, which is pretty important for red decks, but there's multiple upsides here that might make it worth playing Nahiri's Warcraft over these other options. Big upside number 1 is this can flip battles. These other options only at creatures or planeswalkers. If your deck is trying to flip a battle, Nahiri's Warcraft goes way up in value. There's several really strong battles, like Innistrad, Ravnica, Chandelar, Takir, Floria, that have low enough defense counters that a single Nahiri's Warcraft can flip them and give you the backside. So that's one way this card is important. The other thing about this card is sometimes, even though you're playing Nahiri's Warcraft, so your red deck has an answer to something like children, sometimes you're going to snipe a Bloodtide Harvester or a Thalia, some smaller threat. And in those scenarios, this turns into like a weird red Anticipate on top of a removal spell. It's a straight up 2-for-1. You kill a small creature like a Bloodtide Harvester. You look at your top 3 cards, you snag one of those cards, you get to play one of those cards this turn. That's actually a super strong line. And remember, it says play the card rather than cast the card. So this means you can play a land with it, which opens up the same line that we see with Expressive Iteration being so busted. Like on turn 4, you Nahiri's Warcraft, you kill something, you dig, you find the land, you play the land as your land for your turn, which helps get around the downside that if you're casting this on turn 4, you're probably not going to have the mana to cast an actual spell, but being able to hit a land drop off this is super powerful, just like Expressive Iteration. So I think that Nahiri's Warcraft, this definitely has a role in Standard. If your deck is trying to flip battles, if you are going to be killing shoulders, like maybe this is just the best option. I'm a little hesitant just because it's a sorcery and we have instant speed options, but when you add in all these upsides, the upsides of maybe anticipating, of doing the Expressive Iteration trick, of hitting an extra land on turn 4, of sniping a battle, maybe Nahiri's Wrath is just worth it, even though it's going to be sorcery speed rather than instant. We also got a really solid white battle in Invasion of Gobakhan, which I have no idea where Gobakhan is. I feel like I've said that about a lot of these battles, but the card itself is pretty sweet. So 2 mana, 3 defense counters, one of the least amount of defense counters we've seen on a battle so far, which is good because flipping this one is actually pretty important. So the front side, when it enters a battlefield, you look at target opponent's hand, you can exile a non-land card from their hand, and for as long as that card remains exiled, the player can play it, but they gotta pay 2 extra mana. So essentially a white Thoughtseize, 2 mana white Thoughtseize. The backside, Light Shield Array, is an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn. So a little nice synergy with the battle archetype. You're attacking the battle, and then you flip it, and then on your end step, you get counters on whatever attacked the battle, or whatever attacked your opponent, and then sacrifice it. Creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So the front side of this card, it literally is the closest we've seen to a white Thoughtseize. It's essentially formatted like Elite Spellbinder, Anointed Peacekeeper, where you're getting rid of the card temporarily. You're essentially taxing a specific card in your opponent's hand. I do wonder, we saw Elite Spellbinder be great. We've seen Anointed Peacekeeper be okay. I do wonder if having a body is pretty essential. Like, is Elite Spellbinder without a body a good card? Like, part of what made Paulo so powerful is you play it, you get a on-curve creature that can start attacking, and you're slowing down your opponent's game plan. Invasion of Gobakhan, you're not getting the tempo aspect. Like, you're not adding a body to the battlefield. You are slowing down your opponent. So I think that this is a battle that you really want to be flipping. If you do want to fully embrace the front side, it does synergize with Drannith Magistrate. Just exile stuff, make your opponent not play it. We've played some janky brews around this in like Pioneer and Explorer and Historic. I think I would throw Invasion in there as well, because it does synergize really well there. The backside of this card, we don't actually have a direct comparison. There's never been a card that on your end step puts a counter on each thing that attacked this turn. We've had things like Rebel Belt Raiders, Fenrir Firstborn, that when they attack, they trigger and put a counter on all your attacking creatures. Light Shield Array is kind of that with a little bit of a delay, but it is repeatable. Every single turn that you attack with stuff, you're going to be growing your team, which is powerful, and then you're also getting literally heroic intervention. I guess the downside is it's sitting on the battlefield, so you're not going to get some ridiculous blowout because your opponent doesn't see it coming, but still, hexproof and indestructible for all of your creatures is a really good way to protect your team for the most part. So I think that this card can actually be pretty good. I know for the most part we've evaluated battles based purely on the front side because a lot of them have a high amount of defense counters. The difference with Invasion of Gobakhan is it's only 3 defense counters, like a single Harbin attack and you flip this, a single Bloodtide Harvester attack and you flip this. So this actually seems pretty practical to flip. It doesn't seem like you got to invest a lot of time and effort in attacks to actually get the backside, and then the backside, assuming you are some sort of go wide creature deck, is really strong. It's strong when it sits out, and then it's strong when you sacrifice it as well. In Magical Christmas Land, it is technically possible to flip this on turn 2 in Standard. You gotta get really lucky. You gotta Delver turn 1, flip Delver, blind flip it turn 2, into Invasion, attack the Invasion with the Delver, flip it, get the backside, grow your Delver. Like, the odds of this happening are not very high, and sadly, battles don't synergize with Delver because they're not instant Censor sorceries, but if you ever pull this off, it is a ridiculously fast start. The other downside of this card, and it's not a deal breaker here, but the protection mode, this sacrifice it for hexproof and indestructible, it's actually kind of weak in our current standard, just because Farewell is a really popular wrath, and now we're getting Sunfall, which will also probably be a pretty popular wrath. So some of the most popular sweepers in the format, Exile, and exiling gets around hexproof and indestructible. So while it's still definitely nice protection, and it's still helpful, I'm going to filter the Brothers Sedan or Depopulate or Targeted Removal or whatever, there are still cards that get around this. So Invasion of Gobakhan, I think this card is going to see a lot of play in Standard. I would guess that its main home is going to be in the sideboard. I'm not sure it's going to be worth it in the decks that would want this, which are going to be aggro go-wide creature decks. I'm not sure it's going to be worth to spend turn 2 casting a pseudo Thoughtseize and not adding a body to the battlefield. That seems a little bit sketchy, at least as a primary game plan. However, out of the sideboard, if you bring this in against a control deck, the Thoughtseize mode is nice at slowing down your opponent. You can even play it later in the game if you want to, try to time it to like get the Wrath out of your opponent's hand, wait till turn 5 and snag the Farewell and make your opponent wait till they get 8 mana to cast it, and then you can flip it easily and get the protection. So I think mono white decks, soldier decks, Rafine decks, various toxic decks, I think this card is at least in the conversation for sideboard slots, and if you can flip it quickly, it can just take over the game with +1/+1 counters. Could also see a dedicated token deck want this. We have a lot of pieces for tokens. They haven't really gotten there in Standard. We've tried a few times, but we do have a lot of good pieces to make a token deck work. Rabble Rousing, Jenny Faye, Wedding Announcement, Resolute Reinforcements. There's a huge list. In tokens, this is going to slow your opponent down. You're going to definitely get a ton of value out of the +1/+1 counter mode, and then the protection is helpful as well. I also think this might be one of the better battles for Commander. In Commander, the front side is kind of meh. Like, you don't really want to Thoughtseize one opponent. You're just going to anger someone. But I think the backside is powerful enough that if you're playing a token style deck, like a Jetmir deck or a Mondrak deck, or a +1/+1 counter deck, a Kroxa, Hamas, Lizelle, then I think this card is great. I think actually you could just jam it in any white deck because the backside is so good. Assuming you got a reasonable amount of creatures and you're planning on attacking, I think the backside is worth the payoff. So if this had 7 defense counters or something, it would be way worse. But because the defense counters are only 3, I actually think this is one of the battles that you play with the goal being to flip them, and I think it's worth it in Standard and maybe in Commander as well. So Invasion of Gobakhan, definitely a really interesting battle, doing something we really haven't seen before as a white Thoughtseize, and unique in the sense that rather than being a battle where you're playing it because the front side is good and the back side is kind of a fringe upside that maybe you get, this is one that I think you're actually playing to try to get to the backside, because the backside is attainable and such a good payoff in the right deck. We also got Phyrexian Censor, which is apparently uncommon. When I first read this card, I didn't really pay attention to its rarity symbol, and I just assumed it was a rare, but actually it's only going to be an uncommon. So 3 mana 3/3 Phyrexian Wizard. It says each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian spell each turn, and non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tapped. So this card, obviously, to get full advantage out of it, you're going to need a lot of Phyrexians in your deck, but in a deck with a lot of Phyrexians, this is very strong. If you're full-on Phyrexian Tribal, this is a 3/3 for 3, so reasonable stats, like Anointed Peacekeeper stats, that is all upside for you, and going to be very actively harmful for your opponent. Your opponent, presumably not playing Phyrexians, isn't going to be able to play a creature and immediately block with it, because it's going to come into play tapped. Haste creatures get fully shut down, and your opponent's only going to be able to cast 1 spell each turn, while you get to execute your game plan normally. So this calls back to like Archon of Emuria, a little bit of Thalia Heretic Cathar, although it is worth pointing out with the Thalia comparison, this affects you as well. If you're not full-on Phyrexian Tribal, if you're playing a mix of Phyrexians and non-Phyrexians, or worse yet, just playing a random deck, this card gets much worse because your creatures that are not Phyrexians are going to come into play tapped, and you're going to be taxing your own spell. So in older formats, I don't think this is beating out Archon. Like, Archon doesn't care about Phyrexians. More importantly, it's a flyer, and I think a 2/3 flying creature is just better than a 3/3 ground creature, so I don't think this is going to replace Archon in older formats, unless some sort of Phyrexian tribal deck exists that you can play this in. But in a generic sense, I think Archon still beats it out. So if you're trying to hate on, I don't know, Possibility Storm or whatever, like, janky combo, your opponent's trying to cheat multiple things into play, Archon's still going to be the way to go. As far as standard, though, we got some decks that are naturally built for this. Like, the Toxic decks are already fully Phyrexian, so this is all upside in that deck. I guess the downside is it itself doesn't have Toxic, but I can imagine this at worst being a very solid sideboard card to slow down your opponents. And even in the Toxic deck, if you really think about it, it's still supporting your game plan, because the Toxic decks are trying to be super aggro, and your opponent's going to be trying to play blockers to stop you from killing them with your Toxic creatures. Having those blockers come into play tapped and only being able to play one each turn is actually really powerful in the deck, even if it doesn't have Toxic itself. If you look at something like a Rafine deck, just like an Esper Legends creature style deck, there's actually quite a few Phyrexians in these decks. Skrelv is Phyrexian, Sheoldred is Phyrexian, Gix is Phyrexian, Unkis, Urtai is Phyrexian. The downside is, a lot of your other creatures are not Phyrexians. It's almost 50-50. Is it going to be worth it to have half of your creatures come into play tapped to get the benefit from this card? That's a little bit more questionable. Could also see some homes in older formats. We actually played a Phyrexian Pyre of Heroes deck a while ago. This seems great because its abilities are even more impactful in older formats. Like, in older formats, the one spell each turn, that's actually a really strong effect against Arclight Phoenix strategies, decks cheating things into play. This is going to have a natural home there. But as I said, I think in an absolute sense, if you're just playing generic Coco deck and you want Archon to hate on something, or a similar effect to hate on something, I think you're going to go with Archon as a flyer in an ability that isn't going to accidentally hose your own creatures. So Phyrexian Censor, for being uncommon, this card's really good. I think it certainly has roles in standard, and with the amount of Phyrexians we're getting, maybe there's a chance we see Phyrexian Tribal in older formats too. Speaking of Phyrexian Tribal payoffs, we also got Bloated Processor, and this is another card that's like really powerful, but you really gotta work hard to build around it and be a Phyrexian deck. So 3 mana, 3/2 Phyrexian says sack another Phyrexian, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when it dies, you incubate X, where X is its power. So naturally, if this dies, you're gonna get a 3/3 incubate, but you can also sack things to grow it along the way. So Bloated Processor compares to some of the most heavily played sack outlets in Magic, like Woe Strider, a staple of Pioneer and Explorer decks where you're comboing off of Bolas' Citadel or doing Cat Oven shenanigans. Carrion Feeder, really powerful in older formats. Obviously, Bloated Processor is more mana, but still, sack to put a counter on your thing can grow a creature really, really huge, really, really quickly. The downside of this is, you really gotta be a deck full of Phyrexians. Do we have enough Phyrexians to build Phyrexian Aristocrats? Is that a possibility? And the answer is, it's gonna take some work. So the good news is there's a ton of Phyrexians that care about stuff being sacrificed. There are payoffs for sacrifice effects, there are sacrifice outlets like Drivnod to double up your death triggers, Yara, another sacrifice outlet, Vron, Ellis Elcor, both Blood Artist style effects, even Kinzu, I know it's a jumpstart card or whatever, but even that, like if you're stacking your Phyrexians, they're coming back into play, which is kind of nice. So there's tons of reasons to sacrifice things. There's payoffs for sacrificing things. The question is, what are we sacrificing? That's where this plan gets a little sketchy. I guess you got like Blight Belly Rat, when it dies you get to proliferate, Cacophony Scamp, Crawling Chorus, you can sacrifice twice to Bloated Processor. I think the main answer might actually be tokens. I think that might be the synergy. Skrelv's Hive, for example, it's making a Phyrexian every turn, so you can sack it to your Bloated Processor every turn, and mites are a little bit unmighty because they can't block, so as creatures they're actually kind of weak, but if you can get additional benefit from them, like you sack them to your Bloated Processor, which is then also going to trigger your Vron or whatever, then they become much more exciting. So that's one possibility. Also worth mentioning, once flipped incubate tokens are also going to be Phyrexians. You do need to flip them first, so maybe you need Gliss or something for the auto transform, but still, that's another option. So I think that might be the way to go with Bloated Processor. The other place this is probably going to have a home is in new Brimaz decks in Commander. Brimaz wants a deck full of Phyrexians. It also wants Phyrexians to die to proliferate. Bloated Processor is perfect for this plan. It is a Phyrexian. It likes to die because it incubates, and it's a free way that you can sacrifice a Phyrexian every single turn, which is a nice upside for Brimaz. So I think Bloated Processor, the card is really powerful. It compares to really strong Zac outlets. There's no once per turn restriction or anything. It grows itself. It does something when it dies. The only challenge is it's narrow. It only works in Phyrexian tribal. So if you can harness the power of this card in some sort of Phyrexian aristocrat deck, this card is going to be great, but because it only works with Phyrexians, it's not a Woe Strider replacement or whatever. We also got a Boros mashup in Djeru and Hazoret, a 5-mana 5/4 Boros legendary human god. It says as long as you have one or fewer cards in hand, so if you're Heckben, it has vigilance and haste, and then when it attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You can exile a legendary creature card from among them, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and until end of turn, you can cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So flavor-wise, this card's a little bit weird. Its ability doesn't really reference Djeru or Hazoret. I guess like Vigilance is a Djeru thing, and then Haste is a Hazoret thing, so that feels like a little bit flavorful. I kind of wish the ability of Djeru and Hazoret, though, let you grab a legendary creature or a planeswalker. I think that would be much more flavorful. As far as the card, though, it reminds me a little bit of Winota. You're not going to get the full-on, like, Winota puts 5 things into play out of nowhere and wins the game. So it's definitely Winota at home, a safer version of Winota. But still, if you're playing an aggro deck and this is the top end of your curve, you can slam this and then put some massive thing into play really, really quickly with haste. And even if you got to untap with it, it's not the end of the world. If you think about Standard, there's a ton of legends. Obviously, if you hit a Troxa with this, it pretty much wins you the game, but even hitting a Elishnorn, or really even hitting a Skrelv attached to a hasty 5-mana vigilant hasty 5/4, like, that's still fine value. So the ceiling's really high, but as long as you're getting something for free, it's a pretty reasonable card. I think the best home for this is probably going to be the Jodah deck, the 5-color Jodah deck. So Jodah, you want a bunch of big legends anyway. You want to cascade into them. Djeru and Hazoret actually works really well with it because you're going to have another payoff for having all these big legends in your deck. You can dig through your deck to find your Jodah, whatever other legends, and it's a human. The most common build of Jodah in Standard is actually a 5-color human legend deck to take advantage of stuff like Catilda Dawnheart Prime. So Djeru and Hazoret seems like an auto-include in any sort of Jodah deck is kind of your backup Jodah. The problem with Jodah decks is if Jodah doesn't stick, the rest of your deck's kind of janky, or if you don't find Jodah. But now that we got Djeru and Hazoret is kind of a weird backup payoff for filling our deck with legends, I think that deck gets a lot more consistent. I can also maybe see an argument for playing it in Rafine decks. The only issue is the double red mana cost is a problem. If it was single red, I think you'd be able to splash it in like Esper Rafine off of Plaza Heroes. Double red, though, that is a cost on the mana base, so that's going to take a little bit of building to make it work. Once you get to older formats, the dream is pretty epic. Like, attack with this, cast a free Emrakul, win the game. Attack with this, cast a free Iona, win the game. So this ceiling's super duper high. I think this is also a very Commander focused card. Like, in Commander, over the last year or two, we have gotten a ridiculous amount of support for a legendary theme. Like Kadrik's Soul Kindler, the Paragon Dynamo, Yashimaru. There's so many cards now that refer to other legends. This seems like a great leader for a Boros Legends deck. Like, coming down out of the command zone, if you're playing Commander, you're going to have Anger or some way to give it haste, even if you don't have one or less cards in hand, and then just comes down and starts slamming stuff into play for free. So I think this is going to be a pretty popular build around. One of the best ways to build around in Commander is probably legends that give you extra combat steps. They're a little bit awkward sometimes because Djeru and Hazoret is going to trigger when it attacks. So in theory, you hit a Aurelia or a Godo or a Morag or a Karlash or whatever. Most of the time, you're going to have to wait until the next turn, unless you have other shenanigans shenanigans built in. Probably the best of the bunch is actually Morag. Like, if you play Djeru and Hazoret, you attack, you hit the Morag, go to your second main phase, make your land drop, then you get an extra combat step, you get to attack again, and then who knows, then you can hit your Aurelia or Godo or Karlash, and once you start untapping with these cards, and you're getting 2 or 3 or 4 Djeru and Hazoret triggers each turn, you are pretty quickly going to bury the table in free legend values. So Djeru and Hazoret, the card's pretty interesting. At 5 mana, I don't know how good it'll be in standard. I think it's very good in the right deck. You really got to be the legend deck. You got to have a plan for setting this up, having huge legends, having that Atroxa hit or whatever. In that deck, I think it's going to be really, really good. Outside of a actual legend archetype, though, it gets a lot worse. In Commander, I think it'll be a popular commander and really good in the 99 of other decks that care about legends. We also got Rampaging Raptor, which I think is kind of a really good card. 4 mana 4/4 Dinosaur with Trample and Haste. You can pay 3 to give it +2/+0 until end of turn, and then whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target Planeswalker that player controls or battle that player protects. So this is kind of Red Questing Beast. I think that was the first comparison. I guess another comparison would be Red Uvenwald Oddity. Either way, those are very good cards. 4/4 Trample Haste with upside. That's already playable stats. And in our current standard, where we're going to have a ton of battles floating around, the Questing Beast-like ability to hit your opponent and then also snipe a Planeswalker, or in this case, a battle if you choose to, is really strong. This can be coming down by surprise and flipping battles out of nowhere. So that makes flipping battles way easier. One of the things we've talked about throughout spoiler season is it going to be worth it to attack battles? Is it going to be worth it to give up damage at your opponent's face to flip a battle? Well, Rampaging Raptors takes that choice away. You get to damage your opponent's face and still flip the battles, which is really, really good. Its main competition, I think, is Thundering Raju, which is kind of similar if you put the counter on Thundering Raju. It is a 4/4 hasty 4 mana threat in red as well. Although Thundering Raju is going to be rotating, plus it doesn't synergize with battles, plus we're heading back to Ixalan, which is like Dinosaur World. So this card probably benefits from some tribal synergies in the future. So for now, it really depends on your deck. If you're playing a modified deck where you got a bunch of counters, then Thundering Raju is probably still better. But if you're playing a battle deck, this is a very legit way to flip your battles. The only thing I'll say that's kind of a drawback is it does line up kind of awkwardly with Shieldred, a 4/5, really good at shutting down a 4/4. Although at least Rampaging Raptors, if you get the mana, you can pump it to get through the Shieldred. So I really like this card. I think this is pretty close to the Red Questing Beast and probably has a pretty important role to fill, especially in battle decks and standard. We also got a new Rona, and it is a good one. Rona, Herald of Invasion, flips into Rona Tolarian Obliterator. So front side, 2 mana 1/3 legendary human wizard. When you cast a legendary spell, you get to untap it, and you can tap it to draw a card and discard a card. So 2 mana looter with some upside in a legendary deck. And then you can pay 6 mana or 5 and 2 life thanks to Phyrexian mana and transform into Rona Tolarian Obliterator, which is one of the sweetest cards I've seen in a while. So a 5/5 trampler. This says, when a source deals damage to it, the source's controller exiles a card from their hand at random. If it's a land card, you can put it onto the battlefield under your control. Otherwise, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. So the backside of this card is bonkers. It is worth pointing out, like, it's 7 mana to get to it. You got to pay 2, and then you get your looter, and then at some point in sorcery speed, you got to pay 5, and then the Phyrexian mana to actually flip it. So it's going to be a process to getting to the backside, but if you do, the backside can do some super cool things. So front side, pretty straightforward. It's a Merfolk looter. It's a Jace Vryn's Prodigy. Pretty powerful effects. Like a 1/3 is reasonable stats for a looter. Being able to churn through your deck is nice. And then if you're some sort of legend deck, this can be looting multiple times a turn. Or maybe you can sneak in an attack and then untap it and loot with it. And we have decks that would already want this effect. If you look at like Esper Legends, you can probably make room for this. The 2 big 2-drops are Dennick and Thalia, but there's probably a way to squeeze in some number of Ronas to filter through extra lands to find whatever payoff you need, and it synergizes pretty well with Shieldred. Shieldred likes you drawing cards, and drawing extra cards with Rona means extra life with Shieldred, so that's one possibility. Could also just kind of play it for value and a random blue tempo deck where you just play this early and loot away your extra lands, fill your graveyard, get reanimation targets like Atroxa in the graveyard, and then eventually actually flip it. If you flip it, this card is so cool. So it's essentially like a Phyrexian Obliterator or Phyrexian Vindicator mixed with Extract Brain's ability when it takes damage. Rather than dealing some damage or making your opponent sack stuff, if your opponent damages this, you get a card at random from their hand and you get to play it for free. You could be hitting some ridiculously huge Emrakul, Iona, Atraxa level threat and getting it for 0 mana. Worst case, you're going to land out of the deal, so it's a ramp card, which is fine. The most interesting part of this card, though, is unlike the other Obliterators, a Phyrexian Obliterator, Phyrexian Vindicator, this has a bit of a twist, which is, if you read this closely, it doesn't only work with your opponents. It says whenever a source deals damage to it, the source's controller exiles a card from their hand at random. So what this means is we can damage our own Rona and cast cards for free from our hand, which makes it a lot easier to build around. So we can like play with Fire Rona, and then hopefully exile a 1 with a Multiverse, or Portal to Phyrexia, and play that for free, which is ridiculous. Once you go back to like Commander, or I guess Legacy or Modern, you have cards like Pestilence, which is just like 1 mana to deal damage to everything that can repeatedly ping a Rona. If you're playing a Commander deck, you can easily set up a board state where for like 4 or 5 mana, you can just ping Rona enough times that you play your entire hand for free, which is absurd. Fight spells, also another way to take advantage of it, stealing cards off the top of our opponent's deck. So I gotta say, Rona, Herald of Invasion, and / Rona, Tolarian Obliterator, I think this card's really sweet. The front side is fine on its own. 2 mana looters with upside, already fine. And then if you ever get in a position where you can flip it, it is a hilariously fun card to play with. My only concern is, you do got to spend 5 or 6 mana to flip it at sorcery speed, and that is a window to get blown out. You pay 6 mana, pay 5 mana and 2 life, and your opponent just go for the Throats it, or Swords to Plowshares it, whatever, kills it before it even gets a chance to flip. So how practical it's going to be to flip, I'm not really sure, but the front side is good enough that I think even if you're not flipping it very regularly, this is still a pretty solid card. You can just loot through your deck, and then eventually when there's a window when your opponent's tapped out or they're out of cards, and then you flip it around and use the backside to do sweet things and take over the game. In the world of lower rarity cards, Lithomantic Barrage, kind of an interesting hate card. 1 mana sorcery, can't be countered, 1 damage to a creature or planeswalker, except if it's white or blue, then it's 5 damage. So this kind of compares to Fry or Rending Volley. The downside is, it is sorcery speed, which is a drawback. The upside is, it is more damage than Rending Volley. One of the problems with Rending Volley is, it lines up poorly with Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. If your opponent plays Teferi and takes it up, it goes to 5 loyalty, you can't kill it, it sticks around, keeps drawing cards. Lithomantic Barrage is essentially Fry's amount of damage, but for 1 mana, so there is upside for being sorcery speed. The other upside is, assuming this is a sideboard card, this can be sniping non-white or blue creatures as well. You could bring this into kill a Ragavan or some other X1, so we'll have to wait and see, but I think this is roughly on the power level of these other hate cards that you see play, and I think in Standard we'll certainly see this as a sideboard hate card for decks like Soldiers, Rafine, Esper style decks, and in older formats I think it's in the conversation with these other 2 cards for being a sideboard option there as well. We also got a lower rarity transform card, which in general I think most of these cards are designed for limited, they're just kind of expensive, but Khenra Spellspear caught my eye. 2 mana 2/2, Trample Prowess Jackal Warrior. You can pay 4, or actually 3 in a Phyrexian blue mana, so 3 and 2 life, to transform it into Phyrexian Spellstalker, a 3/3 Trample Ward 2 Prowess. So I actually kind of like this card for some sort of Spellslinger Prowess deck. If you think about how it plays, it's kind of a little bit like Bone Crusher Giant. You can play the front side on turn 2. If you don't have anything else to do, you can just flip it on turn 3. And the backside is kind of scary. Like, a single spell makes it a 5/5, 2 spells make it a 7/7, and it has trample, so it's getting through blockers, and that ward is offering some bit of protection. So I think that Khenra Spellspear, out of all the lower rarity transform cards we've seen, I think this one actually might have a chance to show up in Constructed. As far as lower rarity battles, we got Invasion of Eldraine, which isn't as powerful as its namesake that was. 4 mana, when it ATBs, target opponent discards 2 cards, 4 defense counters. If you flip it, you get a 2/2 that says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 2 or fewer cards in hand, it deals 2 damage to them. So Invasion of Eldraine, 4 mana Mind Rot, just a little bit on the expensive side. 3 mana with upside now, like Go Blank, is kind of the going rate. Although in some sort of dedicated rack style deck, the backside is actually kind of nice. Like, it is giving you a pseudo rack ability where once you get your opponent empty handed, this is going to be dealing probably 4 damage a turn, 2 in the air and then 2 more from its ability, which is a pretty fast clock. So we'll have to wait and see. Maybe we can have some sort of like standard 8 rack style deck. Maybe this shows up in like the Explorer Pioneer version that is missing the actual the rack, the literal the rack. But I think I really wish the front side was like 1 less mana, then I would be much more excited about this one. We also got Invasion of Ogrotha, which brings back a surprise Dark Horse old school character, the backside Grandmother Ravi Sengir. So the front side is kind of horrible. 5 mana. When it enters the battlefield, 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life, 5 defense counters. I've been playing a lot of Black Burn lately, and this is just way too much mana for essentially a Lightning Helix. It is literally a sorcery speed Lightning Helix on a permanent, and it's more than double the mana, so it is just way too expensive. The backside, 3/3 flying. When a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on it and gain 1 life. Cool to see Grandmother Sengir making a return. One of my favorite old forgotten characters from the early days of Magic. Unfortunately, it's on a card that I think I'll really only see playing limited, if that. Finally, we got Invasion of Kilem, a 4 mana, 5 defense counter Boros battle. It says when it enters the battlefield, up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+0 in vigilance and haste until end of turn. And then the backside, Valor's Reach Tag Team, a sorcery that makes 2/3/2 red and white warrior creature tokens with whenever this creature and at least 1 other creature token attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So I will say, the backside of this is actually kind of scary. Like 2 3/2s that, if they can attack together, will become 4 3s and then 5 4s. That's actually a lot of power. The front side, though, a little bit overcosted. Giving 2 creatures +2/+0 and maybe even some upside usually costs about 2 mana at instant speed. This is 4 mana at sorcery speed. So I think the cost of the front side might keep this one from seeing constructed play. One thing I do really like about this card, though, is the pump mode. The haste is going to be hard to use, but the pump mode is going to make it easy to flip the Saga, which is probably why it's costed as it is. Like, if you have a couple of random 1/1 flyers on the battlefield, this is going to give you enough damage that you just immediately swing in with those flyers, hit the battle, cast the sorcery side, get these big tokens, hopefully use them to win the game. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. The front side being a little bit overcosted is definitely a concern, but I do like how it snowballs with itself, which might give us some potential. Last but probably least, a bunch of lower rarity stuff, a ton more flip cards. These, I think, for the most part, they're just a lot of mana to flip, so I don't think it's really gonna be worth it to flip them very often in 60 card formats. I think these mechanics are gonna be great in limited, where it gives you a creature that you can play early, and then when you run out of things to do later in the game, you can turn into an even more powerful creature. So I think great limited cards, but I would kind of be surprised if most of these were actually gonna see constructed play. And then a couple of just removal spells for limited for the most part. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily March of the Machine spoilers for today. So what do you think about all the cards we talked about today? Let me know in the comments. We're getting closer to the end of spoiler season. Couple days to go. We should get the full set on Wednesday. So now that we've got a pretty good picture, what do you think of this set? How powerful is it? How flavorful is it? What are you hyped for? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back tomorrow with more daily March of the Machine spoilers. So until then, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.